My millionaire husband left me $125 million and his mansion. Nothing for my sons who abandoned me. Neither had visited during Jameson's final months. While Margaret held his hand through chemotherapy sessions and read to him during sleepless nights, his sons sent occasional text messages asking about Dad's condition, like he was a stock investment rather than their father. Have you ever been overlooked, dismissed, or treated like you didn't matter by people who should have loved you? Hi viewers, kindly tell us where you're watching from and what time it is. Warm welcome to the family, enjoy the story. The wealthy widow walked out of the Denver law office with $125 million while her stepchildren got nothing. But the real shock wasn't the money, it was the handwritten letter her husband left behind, revealing secrets that would destroy his sons' lives forever. Inside that letter were photographs and evidence of something so devastating, it would make the inheritance battle look like child's play. Have you ever wondered what happens when karma finally catches up to those who abandoned you? Have you ever been overlooked, dismissed, or treated like you didn't matter by people who should have loved you? Margaret faced 32 years of cold shoulders, whispered accusations, and complete abandonment from the very people who now wanted her fortune. What she discovered in that letter would change everything, but was she prepared for the price of justice? The mahogany doors of the law office swung shut behind Margaret Jameson as she clutched the leather portfolio containing documents that would reshape 3 lives forever. For 32 years, she had been the invisible woman in her own marriage, watching her stepchildren treat her like hired help while their father's health declined. Now, as autumn leaves scattered across the Denver sidewalk, she held power she never imagined possible. The reading had taken less than an hour, but the aftermath would last a lifetime. Inside that sterile conference room, she had watched 2 grown men crumble as their father's final wishes stripped away their expectations and handed his entire fortune to the woman they had spent decades trying to erase. But money was just the beginning. The real weapon lay hidden in the sealed envelope tucked inside her purse, a letter that would expose crime spanning generations and prove that sometimes the quietest person in the room holds all the cards. Stay with me because this story will show you that sometimes the quiet ones hold all the power. This is about more than money. This is about justice, survival, and what happens when the overlooked finally get their moment to shine. The leather chairs in the law office smelled like old money and broken promises. Margaret sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, watching Jameson's sons scroll through their phones instead of mourning their father. 3 weeks had passed since the funeral, and neither David nor Michael had called to check on her. Not once. The mahogany conference table reflected the harsh overhead lights as the lawyer shuffled through documents. Margaret remembered another reflection, the way Jameson's eyes had caught the light that first night they met at the charity gala. She had been stepping out of a taxi when he appeared, his strong hand helping her onto the sidewalk. The emerald dress she wore that night had hugged her curves perfectly, and she could still feel the electricity when his fingers lingered on hers longer than necessary. "You're stunning," he had whispered, his voice deep and confident. At 35, Margaret had felt beautiful and desired in a way she never had before. Jameson was 52 then, distinguished and powerful, with silver threading through his dark hair and laugh lines that spoke of a man who knew how to enjoy life. Now, 25 years later, those same eyes were closed forever, and his sons acted like she didn't exist. David, the older son at 45, wore an expensive suit but cheap manners. He kept checking his watch as if the reading of his father's will was inconveniencing his golf game. Michael, 3 years younger, tapped his fingers impatiently on the polished wood, his wedding ring catching the light each time he moved. Neither had visited during Jameson's final months. While Margaret held his hand through chemotherapy sessions and read to him during sleepless nights, his sons sent occasional text messages asking about Dad's condition, like he was a stock investment rather than their father. The lawyer, Mr. Harrison, was a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses who had known the Jameson family for decades. He cleared his throat and looked directly at Margaret with something that might have been sympathy. "Before we begin the formal reading," Harrison said, his voice carrying unusual weight, "there's something Mr. Jameson specifically requested his sons hear first." David looked up from his phone for the first time since arriving. "What kind of something?" Margaret felt her pulse quicken. Even after 3 weeks, she could still hear Jameson's voice from those final days, weak but determined. "Margaret," he had whispered, they think they know everything. But they don't know anything at all. The lawyer reached for a sealed envelope marked with Jameson's distinctive handwriting. The sight of those familiar letters made Margaret's chest tighten with fresh grief. How many love notes had he written her over the years? How many birthday cards signed with that same careful script? Your father wanted me to read this before we discussed the will itself, Harrison continued, breaking the wax seal. Michael leaned forward, finally showing interest. Is this some kind of lecture about family responsibility? Because we don't need. You might want to listen, Margaret said quietly. It was the first time she had spoken since entering the office, and both sons turned to stare at her like they were surprised she could talk. David's face hardened. Listen to what? Another guilt trip about not visiting enough? Dad made his choices, and we made ours. The cruelty in his voice hit Margaret like a physical blow. These were the same words he had thrown at her at the funeral, loud enough for other mourners to hear. She had stood there in her black dress, accepting condolences from strangers who showed more compassion than her own stepsons. Harrison unfolded the letter with careful hands. Before we begin the reading, there's something else, Mr. Jameson left specifically for his sons to hear first. Have you ever sat in a room where you felt completely invisible? Tell me about it in the comments, because Margaret had spent years perfecting that feeling. But today, everything was about to change. The tension in the room shifted like pressure before a storm. David set his phone on the table with deliberate force, while Michael stopped his finger tapping and focused on the lawyer for the first time since arriving. Harrison adjusted his glasses and began reading in a steady voice that carried decades of legal experience. To my sons David and Michael. You are here today because you believe you deserve something from me. You believe that blood entitles you to my life's work. David's jaw tightened. Of course we do. We're his sons. Let him finish, Margaret said, her voice carrying new strength. She remembered Jameson's hands on her waist during their wedding dance, how he had whispered that she was the only woman who ever truly saw him for who he was, not what he could provide. The music had been soft that night, and Jameson had moved with surprising grace for such a large man. You're my fresh start, Margaret, he had murmured against her ear, his breath warm on her neck. With you, I can be the man I always wanted to be instead of the bank account everyone else sees. She had pressed closer to him, feeling safe and cherished in a way that was completely new. Their age difference had never mattered to her. 17 years meant nothing when someone looked at you like you were the answer to prayers they hadn't known they were praying. Harrison continued reading. You stopped being my sons the day you decided my money was more important than my life. When I had my stroke, neither of you visited the hospital. When I started chemotherapy, you sent flowers instead of showing up. When I asked you to have dinner with Margaret and me, you were always too busy. Michael shifted uncomfortably in his chair. We had careers, families, responsibilities. Responsibilities to everyone except the man who raised you, Margaret interrupted, surprising herself with her boldness. The words felt foreign on her tongue. She had spent so many years staying quiet, keeping peace, being the good wife who never caused trouble. Harrison raised his hand for silence and continued. Margaret held my hand through every doctor's appointment. She learned to give me injections when the pain got too bad. She slept in a hospital chair for 6 nights when I had pneumonia. She has been my partner, my companion, and my comfort for over 3 decades. The lawyer paused, looking directly at both sons. The estate is valued at $125 million. The number hung in the air like smoke. David and Michael exchanged glances, and Margaret saw the quick calculation in their eyes. Split between 2 sons, that would be over $60 million each. Enough to change lives, pay off mortgages, secure futures. Dust motes danced in the afternoon sunlight streaming through tall windows as tension filled the room like a living thing. Margaret could hear her own heartbeat, steady and strong despite the circumstances. That's more than we expected, Michael admitted, his voice carefully neutral. It's more than anyone expected, Harrison agreed. Your father's investments performed exceptionally well over the past decade. The Colorado Springs mansion alone is worth $12 million. The portfolio of rental properties adds another $15 million. Now, Harrison said, reaching for the official will documents, let me read your father's final wishes regarding the distribution of this estate. David leaned forward eagerly. Michael's fingers resumed their nervous tapping. Both men looked like gamblers waiting for cards to be revealed. Margaret sat perfectly still, remembering Jameson's final words to her just days before he died. You're going to be surprised, my love. But don't let them see it coming. Let them believe what they want to believe, right up until the moment everything changes. The lawyer opened the sealed envelope containing the official will. His voice was steady and professional as he began to read the formal legal language that would reshape 3 lives forever. What would you do if your family only showed up when money was involved? Because what happened next would prove that Margaret's quiet years of devotion were about to be rewarded in ways that would shock everyone in that room. To my sons, who chose money over mercy. The words hit the room like a physical force. Harrison's voice remained steady as he continued reading, but Margaret could see his hands trembling slightly as he held the document. I leave to my sons David Michael Jameson and Michael Robert Jameson the sum of $1 each, to be paid from petty cash. This nominal amount ensures they cannot contest this will on grounds of being accidentally omitted. The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret could hear the wall clock ticking, the distant hum of traffic outside, even the sound of her own breathing. David's face went white, then red, then purple with rage. What? Michael's voice cracked like a teenager's. That's impossible. There has to be a mistake. Harrison continued without pause. To my beloved wife, Margaret Rose Jameson, who stood by me through sickness and health when my own children could not be bothered, I leave the entirety of my estate. This includes all real property, financial accounts, investments, business interests, and personal belongings. Margaret's pulse quickened as she remembered those passionate nights when she had cared for Jameson, how even in his illness he would trace her collarbone with gentle fingers and tell her she was his salvation. You saved my life in every way a person can be saved, he used to whisper. You gave me love when I thought I was too old and too bitter to deserve it. Those intimate moments had sustained her through the hardest days of his illness, when the chemotherapy left him weak but still determined to show her affection. Even when he could barely lift his head from the pillow, he would reach for her hand and press it to his heart. This is insane. David exploded, jumping to his feet so forcefully that his chair rolled backward. She manipulated him. She poisoned his mind against us. Papers scattered across the polished floor as David swept his arm across the conference table in rage. Legal documents that had taken months to prepare fluttered to the ground like fallen leaves. 32 years, Margaret said quietly, her voice cutting through his outburst. I gave him 32 years of my life. Where were you when he needed his medication every 4 hours? Where were you when he couldn't sleep because the pain was too bad? Where were you when he cried because he missed his dead wife, your mother, and needed someone to hold him? Michael stood up slowly, his face a mask of controlled fury. You're nothing but a gold digger who saw an opportunity and took it. Dad was lonely and vulnerable after Mom died, and you swooped in like a vulture. The accusation stung because Margaret had heard it whispered at social gatherings for years. The young woman who married the older widower. The secretary who caught her boss. The pretty face who traded her youth for security. But they had never seen the real relationship. They had never witnessed Jameson's gentle courtship, his genuine affection, or the way he lit up whenever she entered a room. They had never seen him surprise her with flowers just because, or the way he would pull her close while they watched television and tell her she made him feel young again. Your father saw through your lies years ago, Margaret replied, her confidence growing with each word. He knew you were waiting for him to die so you could divide up his money and forget he ever existed. That's not true, David said, but his voice lacked conviction. Harrison cleared his throat diplomatically. Perhaps we should take a short break. No, Margaret said firmly. Let them hear all of it. Let them understand exactly what their father thought of their behavior. She stood up for the first time since entering the office, feeling taller and stronger than she had in months. The grief was still there, but it was mixed now with something else, a sense of vindication that Jameson had seen the truth and acted on it. He watched you ignore every birthday card he sent. He saved every Christmas gift you returned for cash. He kept track of every phone call you didn't make and every visit you didn't pay. He knew exactly who you were, and he decided you didn't deserve a single penny of what he worked his entire life to build. Michael's face twisted with rage. We'll contest this. No judge in the country will let you steal our inheritance. On what grounds? Harrison asked mildly. Your father was examined by 3 independent physicians in the months before his death. All confirmed he was of sound mind and body when this will was executed. There are multiple witnesses, video recordings of the signing ceremony, and detailed psychiatric evaluations. David began pacing like a caged animal. She isolated him from us. She turned him against his own children. That's elder abuse. Margaret almost laughed at the irony. I isolated him? You lived in California and visited twice a year for 20 minutes each time. You isolated yourselves. The lawyer reached for another envelope, this one sealed with red wax. Actually, there's more. Your father anticipated this reaction and left additional instructions. Have you ever been accused of something you didn't do by people who should have trusted you? Because Margaret was about to discover that Jameson had prepared for this moment in ways that would change everything. That's when the lawyer pulled out the second envelope, the one that would change everything. Harrison broke the red wax seal with deliberate care, as if he understood the explosive nature of what lay inside. The envelope was thicker than the first, and Margaret could see her late husband's distinctive handwriting covering multiple pages. Your father left specific instructions that this letter be read aloud if anyone attempted to contest the will or made accusations against Mrs. Jameson, the lawyer explained, unfolding the papers with steady hands. David had stopped pacing and now stood frozen beside his overturned chair. Michael remained standing but gripped the back of his seat so tightly his knuckles had gone white. Both men looked like they were preparing for impact. Harrison began reading in Jameson's own words, and Margaret could almost hear her husband's voice echoing in the sterile office. To my sons, if you are hearing this letter, it means you have chosen greed over grace and accusations over acceptance. You have proven that even in death, I cannot trust you to behave with dignity. Margaret's hands trembled as she recognized phrases from conversations they had shared during his final months. The letter mentioned intimate details that only she would know. How she would read to him every night when the pain kept him awake, her fingers intertwined with his as she spoke the words that carried him towards sleep. Margaret would sit beside my hospital bed for hours, reading everything from mystery novels to financial reports, whatever I requested. When I was too weak to turn pages, she would do it for me. When I was too sick to eat, she would coax me to take small bites, making every meal feel like a celebration instead of a chore. The letter described moments that felt sacred to Margaret, private exchanges between husband and wife that had sustained them both through the darkest period of their marriage. Even as his body was failing, Jameson had found ways to make her feel alive and desired, whispering that she was the reason he kept fighting. But this letter contains more than memories, Harrison continued, his voice taking on a more serious tone. Your father documented specific evidence of financial impropriety on your parts. David's face went ashen. What kind of evidence? According to this letter, you attempted to have your father declared mentally incompetent in 2019, shortly after his stroke. The petition was filed through a lawyer in Los Angeles, claiming he was no longer capable of managing his affairs. Margaret gasped. She remembered that period clearly. Jameson had been recovering well from his stroke, attending physical therapy and regaining his speech. But he had seemed worried about something he wouldn't discuss with her. The petition was withdrawn when your father's medical team provided overwhelming evidence of his mental acuity, Harrison continued. But he never forgot the attempt to strip him of his independence and dignity. Michael found his voice. That was for his own protection. We were worried about his judgment after the stroke. You were worried about your inheritance, Margaret interrupted, puzzle pieces falling into place. That's why he changed all his passwords that year. That's why he started keeping his financial documents in a safe deposit box instead of the home office. The lawyer turned to a new page of the letter. Your father also documented evidence of financial crimes against other elderly family members. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. David and Michael exchanged a look that confirmed Margaret's worst suspicions. What crimes? She whispered. Harrison's voice remained professionally neutral as he read the damning words. According to this letter, both sons convinced their paternal grandmother to change her will in 2015, shortly before her death. They also accessed their Uncle Robert's accounts during his hospitalization for cancer treatment, transferring funds to cover their personal debts. Margaret felt sick. She remembered Jameson's mother, a sweet woman who had welcomed Margaret into the family with genuine warmth. And Uncle Robert had been one of Jameson's closest relatives, a kind man who had helped pay for David's wedding. Those are lies, David said, but his voice lacked conviction. Dad was paranoid in his final years. He saw conspiracies everywhere. He saw the truth, Margaret replied, understanding flooding through her. He protected me because he knew what you were capable of doing to people who trusted you. The letter contained bank records, timestamps, and witness statements that painted a picture of systematic elder abuse spanning years. Jameson had been quietly investigating his own sons, building a case that would protect his wife and expose their true nature. But the most devastating revelation was still to come. Harrison reached the final page of the letter, and his voice carried new weight as he read the closing words. If you are hearing this letter, know that everything I have written is backed by evidence stored in Safe Deposit Box 847 at First National Bank of Colorado Springs. The key is with Margaret, along with instructions for its contents. Margaret's hand went instinctively to her purse, where the small brass key had rested since Jameson's funeral. He had pressed it into her palm during his final week, making her promise to keep it safe. But the letter was just the beginning. Hidden in the safe deposit box were photographs that would destroy them both. Do you believe people show their true character when money is at stake? Because what Margaret was about to discover would prove that some family members are willing to destroy anyone who stands between them and wealth, even their own father. Share your thoughts in the comments, and stay with me because this story is about to take a turn that will leave you speechless. The brass key felt warm in my palm as Harrison explained what Jameson had hidden away for me to find. I could barely process what I had just learned, that the two men sitting across from me had spent years stealing from elderly relatives, including their own grandmother. My mind flashed back to the night Jameson had given me that key. He was weak from his latest chemotherapy treatment, but his eyes were sharp and focused. Margaret, he had whispered, his hands exploring my body with familiar tenderness, I've been protecting you from something you don't even know exists. I had pressed closer to him in our bed, feeling the warmth of his skin despite his illness. Even then, fighting cancer, he made me feel desired and cherished. What do you mean? I had asked. My sons, he said, his fingers tracing patterns on my shoulder, they see you as an obstacle to their inheritance. But they don't know that I've been watching them steal from other people for years. Now, sitting in that law office, I understood why he had installed those security cameras throughout the house. It wasn't paranoia, it was evidence gathering. Harrison spread photographs across the conference table like he was dealing cards in a high-stakes game. Each image showed David and Michael at different banks, different times, accessing accounts that didn't belong to them. These surveillance photos were obtained legally through your father's private investigator, Harrison explained. They show both sons using power of attorney documents to access their grandmother's accounts 3 months before her death. I stared at a photo of Michael forging his grandmother's signature on a withdrawal slip. The woman who had welcomed me into the family with homemade cookies and warm hugs had been robbed by her own grandson while she lay dying in a nursing home. You can't prove those signatures are forged, David said, but sweat was beading on his forehead. Actually, we can, Harrison replied calmly. Your father hired a handwriting expert. The report is quite detailed. Michael had gone completely silent, staring at the photographs like they were bombs about to explode. His wedding ring caught the light as his hands shook, and I wondered if his wife knew what kind of man she had married. The lawyer pulled out more documents, each one more damning than the last. Bank records showing unauthorized transfers, forged signatures on legal documents, even recorded phone calls where the brothers discussed which relatives would be easiest targets for their schemes. The most disturbing evidence involves your Uncle Robert, Harrison continued, producing medical records alongside financial statements. While he was unconscious following surgery for brain cancer, someone accessed his accounts and transferred $180,000 to cover gambling debts. I gasped, remembering Uncle Robert's funeral 2 years ago. I had wondered why such a successful businessman had left so little for his disabled daughter. Now I knew the truth: his nephews had stolen her inheritance while he was fighting for his life. Dad was losing his mind, David said desperately. He was seeing things that weren't there, making up conspiracies. Your father's mind was perfectly clear, I interrupted, my voice stronger than I had ever heard it. Clear enough to document every crime you committed and smart enough to protect me from becoming your next victim. The room felt charged with electricity as the full scope of their crimes became clear. These weren't desperate acts by struggling men, these were calculated attacks on vulnerable family members who trusted them. Harrison checked his watch. The sons have 30 days from today to file any contest to the will. However, given the evidence of financial crimes against the estate and other family members, any contest will trigger immediate criminal referrals to the district attorney's office. David and Michael exchanged panicked glances. They were trapped, and they knew it. Contest the will and face criminal charges, or walk away with nothing and hope the evidence stayed buried. But I knew my late husband better than that. Jameson had never done anything halfway in his life. There's more, isn't there? I asked Harrison quietly. He nodded gravely. Your husband documented everything because he knew his sons would come after you next. He wanted to make sure you had the tools to protect yourself. I smiled for the first time since Jameson's funeral. After 32 years of being dismissed and overlooked, I finally held real power. Not just money, but truth, the kind of evidence that could destroy lives and reputations with a single phone call. I have 30 days to prepare for war, I said, looking directly at my stepchildren, and thanks to your father, I have weapons you don't even know exist. Would you fight back against family members who betrayed you, or try to make peace? Because what I discovered next would prove that sometimes the only way to honor the dead is to fight for the living, and I was ready for whatever came next. The business card felt crisp between my fingers as I dialed the number Harrison had given me. Detective Rodriguez came highly recommended for private investigations involving financial crimes, and after everything I had learned about David and Michael, I needed someone who understood how deep their corruption ran. Mrs. Jameson, Rodriguez said when I called, his voice warm and professional, Mr. Harrison briefed me on your situation. I think we should meet in person to discuss what your husband uncovered. 2 days later, I sat in Rodriguez's downtown office, surrounded by filing cabinets and case boards covered with photos and documents. He was younger than I had expected, maybe 45, with intense brown eyes and an easy confidence that reminded me I was still an attractive woman at 58. Your stepsons have quite a history, Rodriguez said, spreading files across his desk. This investigation goes back further than your husband realized. I watched him work, noticing the careful way he handled each document and the focused attention he gave to every detail. There was something reassuring about his competence, and I found myself drawn to his quiet strength. How far back? I asked. 15 years, minimum. They'd been targeting elderly relatives systematically, always waiting for moments of vulnerability, hospitalizations, grief, confusion following the death of a spouse. Rodriguez showed me a timeline he had constructed, connecting David and Michael to suspicious financial activity surrounding the deaths of 6 different relatives. Each case followed the same pattern: sudden illness or accident, followed by rapid changes to wills and bank accounts, followed by convenient deaths that left the brothers significantly wealthier. My God, I whispered, understanding the true scope of what Jameson had been protecting me from. They're not just thieves. They're predators. Your husband figured that out, Rodriguez said, his hand briefly touching my shoulder in comfort. The gesture sent an unexpected warmth through my body, reminding me of feelings I thought had died with Jameson. That's why he spent his final years building this case. He knew you'd be their next target. I thought about all those nights Jameson had stayed up late in his study, telling me he was organizing financial records. He had been building a fortress of evidence around me, ensuring that when the attack came, I would be ready. There's something else, Rodriguez continued, pulling out a thick folder marked with police department stamps. I've been in contact with authorities in 3 different states. Your stepsons aren't just local criminals, they're part of a larger pattern. The documents showed similar crimes in California, Nevada, and Arizona, all connected to David and Michael through shell companies and fake identities. They had been operating like a business, targeting wealthy elderly people with methodical precision. How many victims? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. At least 12 that we can prove, probably more. The pattern shows they convinced elderly targets to name them as beneficiaries, then found ways to accelerate their deaths, usually through medication tampering or accidents that looked natural. I felt sick, remembering how concerned they had suddenly become about Jameson's medication schedule in his final weeks. I had thought they were finally showing some care for their father, but now I wondered if they had been planning something more deadly. Your husband's documentation may have saved your life, Rodriguez said gently. The evidence suggests they were planning to challenge his mental competency, have you declared an unfit caregiver, and gain control over his medical decisions. The thought made my blood run cold. If Jameson hadn't acted when he did, I might have ended up like their other victims, isolated, vulnerable, and ultimately dead. Rodriguez leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper that made my pulse quicken for reasons that had nothing to do with fear. Mrs. Jameson, how well did you know your husband's first wife? The question hit me like a physical blow. Linda had died in a car accident 18 months before I met Jameson. It had been a source of guilt for me early in our marriage, wondering if I was somehow replacing a perfect woman, if Jameson loved me as much as he had loved her. I knew she died in an accident, I said slowly. Jameson didn't like talking about it. He said it was too painful. Rodriguez opened another file, this one marked with official police letterhead from 15 years ago. The accident happened on a remote mountain road outside Colorado Springs. Single car crash, no witnesses, no obvious cause. He showed me the police report, and my hand started shaking as I read the details. Linda's car had gone off the road at high speed, rolling multiple times before bursting into flames. The investigation had been brief and inconclusive. What aren't you telling me? I asked, though part of me didn't want to know. Rodriguez met my eyes directly, and I saw the answer there before he spoke. Mrs. Jameson, I don't think your husband's first wife died in an accident. Have you ever discovered something shocking about someone you thought you knew completely? Because what Rodriguez was about to tell me would change everything I thought I knew about my stepsons, and make me realize that my own life had been in more danger than I ever imagined. I stared at the yellowed police report spread across Rodriguez's desk, my heart hammering against my ribs. The documents chronicled Linda Jameson's death 15 years ago, a crash that had never made sense to investigators but was ultimately ruled accidental due to lack of evidence. The medical examiner noted some unusual findings, Rodriguez said, pointing to specific sections highlighted in yellow. Linda had traces of sedatives in her system, medications she wasn't prescribed and had no reason to be taking. I thought about the woman in the wedding photos Jameson kept on his dresser. Linda had been beautiful in a classic way, with dark hair and kind eyes. She looked nothing like me, and I had always wondered why Jameson had chosen someone so different for his second wife. Now I was beginning to understand. Maybe it wasn't about choosing differently, maybe it was about choosing someone his sons couldn't easily manipulate. The sedative levels weren't enough to kill her, Rodriguez continued, but they would have made her drowsy, confused, unable to react quickly while driving. My stomach turned as the implications became clear. You think David and Michael drugged her? I think they drugged her, waited for her to get behind the wheel, and followed her to make sure the job got done. Rodriguez pulled out more documents, these showing financial records from around the time of Linda's death. Look at this. The bank statements showed that both sons had taken out substantial life insurance policies on their stepmother just 6 months before her death. The total payout had been over $2 million. They killed her for insurance money? I whispered. Insurance money they desperately needed. David had gambling debts exceeding $300,000, and Michael was facing bankruptcy from a failed business venture. Linda's death solved both problems. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the office air conditioning. These weren't just greedy stepchildren fighting over inheritance. They were killers who had murdered one stepmother and were planning to murder another. Rodriguez moved closer as he explained the evidence, his hand resting on my lower back as he showed me each document. The warmth of his touch sent electricity through my body, reminding me that I was still alive, still capable of feeling attraction despite the horror surrounding us. The most damning evidence is this, he said, producing a photograph that made my blood freeze. It showed Michael's car parked at a gas station just 5 miles from where Linda's accident occurred, time-stamped less than an hour before her death. He followed her, I said, the pieces clicking into place. He drugged her, then followed her to make sure she crashed. And when the police investigated, both sons had perfect alibis. They were together at a restaurant 50 miles away, or so their receipts claimed. Rodriguez showed me how the restaurant receipts had been backdated, how witness statements had been coached, and how the entire investigation had been derailed by false information provided by David and Michael. They've had 15 years to perfect their system, I said, understanding flooding through me. 15 years to learn how to kill people and get away with it. Which is why your husband spent his final months gathering evidence. He figured out what they had done to Linda, and he knew you were next on their list. The thought of Jameson, weakened by cancer but still protecting me, made tears sting my eyes. Even facing death, he had been building a case to save my life. Rodriguez reached across his desk and took my hand in his. The contact was electric, making me aware of my own pulse, my own breathing, my own need for human connection in the face of all this darkness. Margaret, he said softly, using my first name for the first time, you're in real danger. These men have killed before, and they won't hesitate to kill again if they think you're a threat to their freedom. I looked into his brown eyes and saw genuine concern mixed with something else, an attraction that mirrored my own growing feelings. In the space of an hour, he had become my protector and ally, the one person who fully understood the danger I faced. What do we do? I asked. We build a case so strong that they'll never see the outside of a prison cell, Rodriguez replied, his thumb tracing across my knuckles in a gesture that was both comforting and intimate. But we have to be very careful. If they suspect what we know. He didn't need to finish the sentence. If David and Michael realized that their crimes had been exposed, they would act quickly to eliminate the evidence, and me along with it. The medical examiner's report was clear. The first Mrs. Jameson had been drugged before the crash. And her sons had taken out a life insurance policy on her just months before her death. How far would you go to uncover the truth about someone you loved? Because what I was about to discover would prove that some family bonds are forged in blood, but not in the way most people think. Rodriguez and I spent the next 3 hours going through files that painted a horrifying picture of systematic murder. As he explained each case, I found myself leaning closer to him, drawn by his quiet competence and the safety I felt in his presence. This is Eleanor Jameson, your husband's aunt, Rodriguez said, showing me a death certificate from 2018. She died of an apparent heart attack at age 82, just 2 weeks after changing her will to name David and Michael as primary beneficiaries. I remembered Eleanor, a vibrant woman who had been in perfect health when I saw her at Christmas that year. She had been planning a cruise to Europe and talking about redecorating her house. Heart attack victims usually have warning signs, previous episodes, risk factors, Rodriguez explained. Eleanor had none of those. But she did have this. He showed me hospital records indicating unusual levels of digitalis in Eleanor's system, a heart medication that could be lethal in large doses. Someone with access to her home could have crushed digitalis tablets into her food or drinks over several days, Rodriguez continued. The symptoms would look exactly like a natural heart attack. More files revealed similar patterns with other relatives. Uncle Robert's brain cancer had actually been caused by slow poisoning with heavy metals. Cousin Patricia's stroke had been induced with blood thinners. Great-Aunt Helen's pneumonia had been helped along with immunosuppressive drugs. They weren't just stealing money, I realized with growing horror. They were perfecting murder techniques. Each death taught them something new, Rodriguez agreed. How to choose the right drugs, how to avoid detection, how to create believable medical emergencies. As we worked through the evidence, I became increasingly aware of Rodriguez's presence beside me. When he reached across to show me documents, his arm would brush against mine. When he explained complicated medical terminology, he would lean in close enough that I could smell his cologne. After 32 years of marriage, I hadn't expected to feel attraction to another man so soon after Jameson's death. But grief and fear had a way of making you crave human connection, and Rodriguez represented both protection and possibility. "There's something else," Rodriguez said, his voice dropping to a whisper as he showed me surveillance photos of David and Michael meeting with unknown individuals. "I think they're not working alone." The photographs showed both brothers in restaurants and parking lots, exchanging envelopes with people who looked like they belonged in a different world. Rough men with the kind of faces that suggested violence was their profession. Hired killers? I asked. Or at least hired muscle. People who could make deaths look more convincing, who could provide alibis, who could clean up loose ends. Rodriguez's hand found mine as he explained the implications. These weren't just family members driven by greed, they were part of a criminal network that specialized in elderly murder for profit. "How many people know about this investigation?" I asked, suddenly feeling exposed. "Just us and Mr. Harrison," Rodriguez replied. "But we need to assume David and Michael are watching you. They hired a private investigator to dig up information about your past." My heart sank. I had hoped my previous life would stay buried, but apparently nothing stayed secret when millions of dollars were at stake. "What kind of information?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. Rodriguez pulled out a manila envelope with my name written across it in block letters. "They know about your work as a dancer before you met Jameson. They have photographs, employment records, even interviews with former coworkers." Heat flooded my cheeks as I thought about those years before I met Jameson. I had been young, broke, and desperate for work that paid enough to support myself. Dancing at upscale gentlemen's clubs had been lucrative, and I had been good at it, confident in my body and skilled at making men feel special without giving them anything real. "They're planning to use this against you," Rodriguez said gently. "Paint you as a gold digger who seduced their father for his money." "That's not who I was with Jameson," I said firmly. "He saw past all of that. He loved me for who I really am." "I know," Rodriguez said, and the sincerity in his voice made my chest tight with emotion. "But they'll try to use it to undermine your credibility, make it look like you manipulated a vulnerable old man." Rain began pattering against the office windows as Rodriguez and I realized we were being watched. A black sedan had been parked across the street for the past hour, its occupants taking photos of everyone entering and leaving the building. "We need to be careful," Rodriguez said, his hand moving to the small of my back in a protective gesture that made me feel both safe and desired. "If they know we're building a case against them." He didn't finish the sentence, but we both understood. David and Michael had killed too many people to hesitate about killing two more. The private investigator's report landed on the Sun's desk with a thud. Inside were photographs of Margaret's past that could destroy everything. Is it possible to find love again while seeking justice for someone you lost? Because what I was feeling for Rodriguez was becoming impossible to deny, and that made both of us targets for men who had already proven they would kill to protect their secrets. The morning news broadcast felt like a punch to the stomach. There I was on television, 25 years younger, wearing a sequined outfit that left little to the imagination, dancing on a stage while men held up dollar bills. "Local widow's secret past revealed," the headline read, and I knew my stepsons had made their first move in what would become all-out war. I sat in my kitchen, coffee growing cold in my hands, watching reporters turn my previous life into entertainment. The footage was from 1998, back when I was known as Maggie at an upscale gentleman's club called the Gold Room. I had been 33 then, recently divorced, and desperate for work that paid enough to support myself without depending on anyone. My phone rang constantly, reporters wanting interviews, neighbors wanting gossip, even old coworkers calling to ask if I was okay. I let them all go to voicemail. The truth was more complicated than any news story could capture. Dancing had been survival, not choice. After my first marriage ended, I had been left with nothing but debt and a high school education. The gold room paid better in one night than most legitimate jobs paid in a week. But dancing had also been empowering in ways I hadn't expected. Moving my body with practiced sensuality, commanding the attention of powerful men, feeling desired and valuable, it had taught me that I possessed something worth paying for, even if I couldn't name exactly what that was. The club had strict rules. No touching, no private meetings, no relationships with customers. I was there to perform, to create fantasy, to make lonely men feel special for exactly as long as they were willing to pay for the illusion. I had been good at it. My body was strong and graceful from years of dance classes I could barely afford. My smile was genuine because I enjoyed the performance aspect. And I had learned to read men quickly, understanding what they wanted to see, what made them feel powerful and appreciated. Meeting Jameson had changed everything. He wasn't a customer. We met at a charity fundraiser where I was working a legitimate catering job. He saw me serving champagne to wealthy donors and asked if I was single. Just like that, no games, no pretense. "You're beautiful," he had said simply, "but there's something else about you. Intelligence, maybe. Strength. I'd like to take you to dinner sometime." I had been honest with him from the beginning about my work at the Gold Room. Instead of being shocked or judgmental, Jameson had been impressed by my honesty and my determination to support myself. "A lot of people do things they're not proud of to survive," he had said. "What matters is who you choose to be moving forward." Now David and Michael were using my past to paint me as a manipulative gold digger who had seduced their vulnerable father. The news coverage showed the worst possible photos. Me in revealing outfits, surrounded by men with cash, looking every inch the stereotype of a woman who sold herself for money. My phone buzzed with a text from Rodriguez: "Don't watch the news. Don't read social media. Don't let them define you." But it was too late. The damage was spreading across the internet like wildfire. Photos from the Gold Room were being shared thousands of times, accompanied by comments that ranged from slut-shaming to outright threats against my life. "Home-wrecking whore gets what she deserves," one comment read. "This is what happens when old men think with their dicks instead of their brains," said another. "Someone should put this gold-digging bitch in her place." The cruelest part was how they twisted my relationship with Jameson. Headlines like "Sugar Baby Strikes Gold" and "Stripper's Ultimate Score" reduced 32 years of genuine love and partnership to a mercenary transaction. But I refused to be ashamed. Dancing had been work. Difficult, physically demanding work that required skill and emotional intelligence. I had never hurt anyone, never stolen anything, never destroyed families. I had simply used what I had to survive in a world that offered few options to women without money or education. Unlike my stepsons, who had built their wealth on the corpses of elderly relatives. When Rodriguez arrived at my house that evening, I was ready for him. Not just emotionally, but physically, dressed in clothes that reminded me of my own power, makeup that emphasized my still attractive features, posture that showed I wouldn't be broken by their attacks. "How are you holding up?" he asked, concern clear in his dark eyes. "Better than they think," I replied, surprised by the strength in my own voice. "Let them use my past against me. At least I earned my money honestly." Rodriguez smiled, and I saw admiration in his expression alongside the attraction that had been building between us for weeks. "Your past doesn't define you, Margaret. But your strength does." Standing in my living room, facing a man who saw me as more than my mistakes or my history, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: desire for the future instead of just grief for the past. But Margaret had been recording her conversations with the sons all along, and their latest threats were about to become their biggest mistake. Should someone's past define their worth in the present? What do you think? Because what I was about to reveal would prove that some secrets are weapons, and I had been quietly building an arsenal while my enemies thought I was defenseless. The recording device had been Jameson's idea, hidden in a pen that looked completely ordinary but captured crystal clear audio of every conversation. For weeks, I had been carrying it whenever David or Michael called, documenting their increasingly desperate threats as they realized their inheritance was slipping away. Now, sitting in Rodriguez's car outside the courthouse, I listened to their own voices condemning them. "We need to discredit her completely," David's voice said through the tiny speakers. "Make her look like such a gold-digging whore that no jury would ever believe her over us." "The dancing thing is good," Michael replied, "but we need more. Something that makes her look unstable, maybe dangerous." "What about an accident?" David suggested, his voice so casual it made my skin crawl. "She's been under a lot of stress lately. Grieving widow, facing financial pressures, maybe she has a breakdown behind the wheel." Rodriguez's hand found mine as we listened to them plot my death with the same matter-of-fact tone they might use to discuss the weather. These recordings would destroy any sympathy they might have gained from the media coverage about my past. "We'll release these tomorrow," Rodriguez said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Every news station that ran those stories about your dancing will have to run these too." I felt a surge of power unlike anything I had experienced since Jameson's death. For months, I had been reacting to their attacks, defending myself against their accusations. Now I could take the offensive. My confidence was intoxicating, to myself and apparently to Rodriguez. As we sat in his car, sharing this moment of victory, I became acutely aware of the attraction that had been building between us. The way he looked at me had changed from protective concern to something much more personal and heated. "You're incredible," he said softly, his eyes moving from my face to my lips and back again. "Most people would have crumbled under this kind of attack. But you're stronger than they ever imagined." The compliment sent warmth through my entire body. It had been so long since a man looked at me with desire instead of pity, saw strength instead of victimhood, appreciated my intelligence instead of just tolerating it. "I learn from the best," I replied, thinking of Jameson's quiet lessons in strategy and patience. "He taught me that the most powerful people are often the ones everyone underestimates." When the recordings aired that evening, public opinion shifted like a sudden storm. The same news programs that had savaged my reputation 12 hours earlier now played audio of David and Michael casually discussing my murder. Social media exploded with outrage, but this time it was directed at them. "These men are literally planning to kill their stepmother," one viral post read. "Forget the inheritance, these psychopaths belong in prison," said another. "Anyone who threatens a widow like this deserves whatever justice brings them." My phone rang with calls from reporters who wanted to interview me, lawyers offering to represent me, and strangers expressing support and admiration. For the first time since this battle began, I felt like the public saw the real story instead of the version David and Michael had tried to create. The legal implications were immediate. Harrison called within an hour of the broadcast to inform me that the district attorney's office was opening a criminal investigation into the recorded threats. Any attempt by David or Michael to contest the will would now be seen as harassment of a crime victim. But the most satisfying moment came when I watched the evening news coverage of reporters waiting outside David's house in California. He emerged looking haggard and desperate, shouting at cameras about how the recordings were taken out of context and demanding privacy for his grieving family. "Mrs. Jameson," one reporter called out, "do you have any response to your stepchildren's recorded threats against your life?" David's face went pale as he realized the question was being broadcast live. "Those were private conversations." "About murdering your stepmother," the reporter interrupted. "Are you denying that you and your brother discussed staging her death to look like an accident?" Watching David crumble on television felt like justice served with interest. For 32 years, I had listened to him dismiss me, ignore me, treat me like an inconvenience to be tolerated. Now the whole world could see what he really was. News vans lined the street outside the mansion as reporters clamored for Margaret's statement. But the Sons had one final card to play, a secret about Jameson that would either vindicate Margaret or destroy her completely. "Have you ever had to fight to protect your reputation? How did you handle it?" Because what my stepsons revealed next would test every lesson Jameson had taught me about patience, strategy, and the long game of justice. The FBI raid happened at dawn, but I was already awake, sitting in the mansion's master bedroom with Rodriguez beside me. We had spent the night there together, not just planning our next moves, but finally acting on the attraction that had been building between us for weeks. Making love in the bed I had shared with Jameson should have felt wrong, but it didn't. It felt like claiming my space, my power, my right to move forward with life instead of being trapped in grief. Rodriguez understood that I wasn't trying to replace my husband, I was honoring his memory by refusing to let his killers destroy me. "You're sure you're ready for this?" Rodriguez asked as we watched unmarked cars pull up to David's house on the news. "More than ready," I replied, wearing one of my most elegant dresses. The kind that reminded everyone I was a woman of substance, not the broken widow my stepsons thought they were fighting. The search warrants were based on evidence Rodriguez and I had compiled over weeks of investigation. Financial records, recorded threats, witness statements, and most damning of all, Jameson's final video message that we had discovered in his safe deposit box just days before. I had watched that video alone first, needing to process what my husband had recorded during his final weeks of life. Sitting in his study, cancer-ravaged but mentally sharp, Jameson had documented everything he knew about his son's crimes. "Margaret," he had said, looking directly into the camera, "if you're watching this, it means they've made their move against you. But you're not defenseless. Everything you need to destroy them is in this room." The video showed Jameson pulling out files, photographs, and documents that painted an even more complete picture of David and Michael's criminal enterprise than we had imagined. But the most shocking revelation was what he said next. "I know they killed Linda. I've always known. I married you partly because I needed someone strong enough to survive them, smart enough to outwit them, and brave enough to see justice done." Understanding flooded through me as the final pieces fell into place. Jameson hadn't just loved me, he had chosen me as his partner in the long game of bringing his sons to justice. Every gentle lesson about patience and strategy, every document he had shown me just to keep me informed, every conversation about protecting myself. It had all been preparation for this moment. The video revealed that Jameson had been gathering evidence for 15 years, building a case that would be bulletproof when the time came. He knew he was dying, knew his sons would come after me, and knew I would need overwhelming proof to survive their attacks. "They think you're weak because you're kind," Jameson said in the recording. "They think you're stupid because you're gentle. They think you're vulnerable because you grieve honestly. Use their assumptions against them, my love. Let them underestimate you until it's too late for them to recover." Rodriguez had been amazed by the sophistication of Jameson's planning when I showed him the video. "Your husband was playing chess while his sons were playing checkers," he said with obvious admiration. Now, watching federal agents search David's house, I finally understood why Jameson had seemed so calm in his final months despite knowing he was dying. He wasn't just leaving me money. He was leaving me justice. My phone rang with updates throughout the morning. David and Michael had both been taken into custody on multiple federal charges including conspiracy to commit murder, elder fraud, and racketeering. The evidence was so overwhelming that their lawyers were already discussing plea agreements. But the most satisfying call came from Harrison, who had news that made me smile for the first time in months. "The life insurance companies are voiding all policies David and Michael held on elderly relatives," he reported. "They're demanding repayment of previous claims, which totals over $8 million. Even if they somehow avoid prison, they'll be financially ruined." Rodriguez pulled me close as we watched the news coverage of both sons being led away in handcuffs. "It's over," he said softly. "They can't hurt you anymore." Looking at this man who had helped me find justice and rediscover desire, I felt something I hadn't experienced since before Jameson's illness: hope for the future. "No," I corrected him, "this isn't the end. This is the beginning." The FBI raid on the sons' homes uncovered evidence of crimes spanning 3 decades. But the biggest shock was waiting in Jameson's final video message. As Margaret watched her stepsons led away in handcuffs, she realized her real inheritance wasn't money, it was freedom. "Do you believe in cosmic justice, that wrongdoers eventually get what they deserve?" Because what I discovered about my own strength during this battle would change not just my future, but the futures of other women who needed someone to fight for them. The courtroom was packed with reporters, distant relatives, and curious onlookers who had followed our story through months of media coverage. I sat in the front row, wearing my best navy suit and the pearl necklace Jameson had given me for our 20th anniversary, watching justice finally unfold. David and Michael sat at separate defense tables, no longer the united front they had presented during the will reading. Prison jumpsuits had replaced their expensive suits, and both men looked like they had aged years in the few months since their arrest. The prosecutor played Jameson's deathbed video for the jury, and I watched 12 strangers see my husband as I had known him, brilliant, strategic, and deeply protective of the people he loved. Even weakened by cancer, his voice carried authority as he methodically presented evidence of his son's crimes. "I married Margaret because I recognized her strength," Jameson said in the recording, his eyes looking directly into the camera. "She survived things that would have destroyed weaker people. She rebuilt her life through determination and courage. When I realized what my sons were capable of, I knew she was the only person strong enough to see justice done." The video showed intimate moments between us that proved our genuine connection, Jameson reading to me from financial reports I had requested, both of us laughing at some private joke, his hand reaching for mine when he thought the camera wasn't recording. These weren't the interactions of a gold digger and her victim, but of partners who respected and cherished each other. Most importantly, the video documented Jameson's mental clarity during the months he was gathering evidence. Medical experts testified that his cognitive function was perfect even as his body was failing, destroying any argument that he had been manipulated or confused. When the defense tried to suggest that I had somehow coerced Jameson into making the video, the prosecutor played audio recordings of him working alone in his study, dictating notes and analyzing financial records with the precision of the successful businessman he had always been. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. When they returned with guilty verdicts on all counts, I felt Jameson's presence in that courtroom as clearly as if he were sitting beside me. We had done it together, exposed the truth and protected future victims from David and Michael's predatory schemes. During the sentencing phase, I was allowed to give a victim impact statement. Standing at that podium, facing the men who had spent years trying to destroy me, I finally had the chance to speak my truth. "David and Michael Jameson stole more than money from their victims," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. "They stole final months with loved ones, peaceful deaths, family legacies that took lifetimes to build. They turned trust into a weapon and used love as a tool for murder." I looked directly at both of them as I continued. "Your father spent his final months protecting me because he knew what you were. Even dying, he was a better man than either of you will ever be. And now the whole world knows it too." The judge sentenced David to life in prison without possibility of parole. Michael received the same sentence plus an additional 25 years for the murder of their stepmother Linda. Both men would die behind bars, just as their victims had died, alone and forgotten. As I watched my stepsons led away in chains, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: complete safety. For the first time since Jameson's diagnosis, I could plan for tomorrow without wondering if I would live to see it. Rodriguez was waiting for me outside the courthouse, and when he pulled me into his arms, I knew I was ready for the next chapter of my life. Justice had been served, but more importantly, I had discovered my own strength. "What does true freedom mean to you?" Rodriguez asked as we walked toward our future together. "It means the power to choose love over fear," I replied. "And that's exactly what I'm going to do." What does true freedom mean to you? Share your definition in the comments, because sometimes the greatest victories aren't about what we gain, they're about what we refuse to lose. 6 months after the trial, I stood in the mansion's garden wearing a simple white dress, surrounded by people who genuinely cared about me. Rodriguez looked handsome in his dark suit, his brown eyes reflecting the same love I felt blooming in my chest like the roses Jameson had planted years ago. The wedding was small but perfect. Harrison served as my legal witness. Detective Morrison from the FBI gave Rodriguez away since his parents had passed, and even some of the journalists who had covered our story attended to celebrate instead of investigate. "Do you, Margaret Rose Jameson, take Carlos Rodriguez to be your husband?" the minister asked. "I do," I said, meaning it completely. This wasn't a replacement for what I'd had with Jameson, it was something entirely new, built on shared purpose and mutual respect rather than the careful protection Jameson had provided. Rodriguez slipped a simple gold band onto my finger, next to the engagement ring he had chosen, nothing flashy or expensive, just beautiful and genuine like our relationship. With this ring, I promise to stand with you, fight beside you, and love you exactly as you are. Our wedding night was passionate and tender, two people who had found each other through circumstances neither would have chosen but both were grateful to have survived. Rodriguez understood that I brought grief and strength in equal measure, that my past included both dancing and devotion, that I was capable of both gentleness and fierce protection. Making love with him felt like coming home to myself, not the woman I had been with Jameson, but the woman I had become through fighting for justice and refusing to be destroyed by people who underestimated my resilience. The foundation we established together became our shared mission. The Jameson Foundation for Elder Justice provided legal assistance, financial support, and investigative services to elderly people facing abuse from family members. Within the first year, we had helped expose 12 cases of financial fraud and prevented at least 3 murders. "Your husband would be proud," Rodriguez said one evening as we reviewed case files in the study where Jameson had planned our victory over David and Michael. "He'd be amazed by how many predators are out there," I replied, reading about yet another case of adult children drugging their parents to gain control of bank accounts. "But I think he'd be happy that we're stopping some of them." The foundation bore Jameson's name but reflected everything I had learned about the intersection of love, money, and family violence. We hired investigators like Rodriguez, lawyers like Harrison, and social workers who understood that elder abuse usually came from the people victims trusted most. Every case we solved felt like honoring both Jameson's memory and Linda's, along with all the other victims who had died before anyone thought to investigate their suspicious deaths. We were building something lasting from their tragedy. The most satisfying moment came when we received a letter from an elderly woman in Arizona whose daughter had been stealing from her for years. Using the evidence we helped gather, prosecutors secured a conviction and recovered over $200,000 in stolen assets. "I thought I was going crazy," the woman wrote. "Everyone said my daughter loved me and would never hurt me. Thank you for believing me when no one else would." That letter reminded me why Jameson had chosen me as his partner in justice rather than simply his comfort in dying. He had seen something in me that I was only now beginning to understand, not just the ability to survive, but the determination to use survival as a weapon against people who preyed on the vulnerable. Rodriguez and I had created the family neither of us expected but both of us needed. Not through blood or obligation, but through choice and shared purpose. We were partners in every sense, in bed, in work, in the daily business of building something meaningful from the ruins of what others had tried to destroy. But Margaret's story was far from over. A knock at the door brought news that would change everything once again. "How do you think justice should be balanced with mercy in family situations?" Because what I was about to discover would test everything I thought I knew about forgiveness and the possibility of redemption. The young woman standing on my doorstep had Jameson's eyes and Linda's delicate bone structure, but something uniquely her own in the determined set of her jaw. She couldn't have been more than 25, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and clothes that suggested she worked for a living rather than lived off family money. "Mrs. Jameson," she said quietly. "My name is Sarah Chen. I think Jameson was my biological father." Rodriguez appeared behind me, his protective instincts immediately engaged by an unexpected visitor. After everything we had been through with David and Michael, surprise guests made us both nervous. "I'm sorry," I said carefully, "but I think there's been some mistake. Jameson only had 2 sons, and they're both in prison." Sarah reached into her messenger bag and pulled out a manila envelope thick with documents. "I've been looking for my father my entire adult life. I finally hired a genealogist who traced my DNA back to the Jameson family line. These are the test results." I invited her inside, more curious than suspicious. Sarah had none of the entitled attitude that had characterized David and Michael. She seemed nervous but determined, like someone who had been preparing for this conversation for years. "I was adopted as a baby," Sarah explained as we sat in the living room where so many life-changing conversations had taken place. "My adoptive parents were wonderful, but I always wondered about my biological family. When I finally started searching, I discovered my birth mother had died in a car accident when I was 6 months old." Rodriguez and I exchanged glances. Another car accident, another convenient death in the Jameson family history. What was your birth mother's name? I asked. Rebecca Chen. She was a graduate student at University of Colorado. According to the records I found, she and a man named Jameson had a relationship in 1998, right before I was born. The timeline made sense. Jameson would have been 55 then, still grieving Linda's death but not yet ready for another serious relationship. A brief affair with a younger woman wouldn't have been out of character for a wealthy widower processing trauma. Sarah showed us photographs of Rebecca, a beautiful Asian American woman with kind eyes and an infectious smile. She looked nothing like Linda or me, which probably explained why Jameson had been able to connect with her during his period of grief. Did she know about the pregnancy? Rodriguez asked gently. According to her friends, yes. But she never contacted Jameson about it. She was planning to raise me alone, maybe because of the age difference or because she didn't want to complicate his life. I studied the DNA results Sarah had provided. They were conclusive. She was definitely related to the Jameson bloodline, and given the timeline, Jameson was the most likely father. Why are you here now? I asked. What do you want from me? Sarah's expression shifted, and I saw something that reminded me powerfully of Jameson, a directness that cut through pretense to get to the heart of matters. I don't want money, she said firmly. I have a good job as a software engineer, my adoptive parents left me comfortable when they passed, and I've never needed financial help from anyone. I just wanted to know about him. What kind of man he was, whether I inherited anything from him besides his DNA. Relief flooded through me. After David and Michael's relentless greed, finding a potential heir who explicitly didn't want money felt like a gift. Rodriguez reached for my hand as we navigated this new complication together. Our relationship had deepened through facing challenges as partners, and I could see him processing the implications of Sarah's appearance with the same careful analysis he brought to our foundation cases. Tell me about yourself, I said to Sarah. What do you do for work? Are you married? Do you have children? Sarah smiled for the first time since arriving. I design security software for banks and investment firms, ironically appropriate given what I've learned about the Jameson family financial crimes. I'm engaged to a wonderful man named David, and we're hoping to have children in the next few years. Hearing about Sarah's stable, honest life made me think about the different paths people could choose despite similar circumstances. She had been raised without wealth or privilege but had built something meaningful through her own efforts. I followed the news coverage of the trial, Sarah continued. I know what David and Michael did to you and to other family members. I want you to know that I'm nothing like them. How can we be sure? Rodriguez asked, his detective instinct still engaged despite Sarah's apparent sincerity. Sarah reached into her bag again and pulled out a letter written in careful handwriting. I brought you this. It's from my birth mother to Jameson, never sent. I found it in her belongings after my adoptive parents died. I read Rebecca's letter with growing understanding. She had loved Jameson but recognized that he was still grieving his wife's death. Rather than complicate his life with news of an unplanned pregnancy, she had chosen to raise their child alone and let him heal in his own time. She sounds like a remarkable woman, I said softly. She was, according to everyone who knew her. Brilliant, independent, kind. She died in a car accident when I was 6 months old, another single-car crash on a remote road. Rodriguez and I looked at each other with sudden alarm. The pattern was too familiar, too consistent with David and Michael's history of eliminating inconvenient people. The DNA results were conclusive, she was Jameson's daughter. But the real question was, had she come for family or money? Would you share your inheritance with a long-lost family member you'd never met? Because what I was about to discover would prove that some family bonds transcend blood, and that sometimes the people who share your DNA are less family than the people who choose to stand with you. The DNA results confirmed what we all suspected. Sarah was indeed Jameson's biological daughter, conceived during a brief relationship with Rebecca Chen in 1998. But more importantly, the investigation Rodriguez and I conducted into Rebecca's death revealed the truth that would finally complete our understanding of David and Michael's crimes. Rebecca hadn't died in a random accident. Like Linda before her, she had been murdered, drugged and run off the road by David and Michael, who had learned about Sarah's existence and saw both mother and child as potential threats to their inheritance. "They killed my birth mother," Sarah said quietly as we sat in the study where Jameson had planned his own war against his sons. "They killed her because she might have asked their father for child support or named me in her will." Sarah's pain was visible but controlled. She had inherited Jameson's emotional strength along with his intelligence, and watching her process this devastating news reminded me of my late husband's grace under pressure. But Sarah surprised us all with her response to learning about her massive inheritance rights. Standing in the same room where David and Michael had raged about being disinherited, she made a choice that proved her character beyond any doubt. "I don't want the money," Sarah said firmly. "Not because I don't believe I'm entitled to it, but because I don't need it to build the life I want." Rodriguez and I looked at each other in amazement. After everything we had witnessed about families destroying themselves over wealth, here was someone voluntarily walking away from millions of dollars. "What do you want?" I asked. "I want to know about my father. I want to understand what kind of man he was, what he valued, how he thought about the world. And I want to help you continue his work." Sarah's decision to join our foundation rather than claim her inheritance transformed our small organization into something much more powerful. Her software engineering skills revolutionized our ability to track financial crimes, while her investigative instincts, inherited directly from Jameson, helped us identify patterns that had previously been invisible. Working together, the three of us became an unstoppable team. Rodriguez provided law enforcement connections and investigative experience. I contributed the hard-won wisdom of someone who had survived elder abuse and financial manipulation. Sarah brought technological expertise and the fresh perspective of someone who understood both privilege and its absence. Within 2 years, the Jameson Foundation had expanded to serve clients in 15 states. We had recovered over $50 million in stolen assets, secured criminal convictions against 43 elder abusers, and prevented an estimated 37 suspicious deaths among elderly people whose families had been targeting them. The work was emotionally demanding but deeply satisfying. Every case we solved felt like honoring Jameson's memory while protecting people who reminded me of my younger, more vulnerable self. We were creating safety for people who had spent their lives taking care of others, only to discover that their own children saw them as obstacles to wealth rather than human beings deserving love and respect. Sarah's engagement to her David, a kind pediatrician who treated her like an equal partner rather than a prize to be won, reminded me daily that healthy relationships were possible even after experiencing the worst of human nature. Watching her plan her wedding, I saw echoes of my own happiness with Rodriguez and felt grateful that trauma hadn't closed her heart to love. The foundation's success also brought unexpected personal rewards. Harrison joined our board of directors, bringing his legal expertise to help us navigate complex inheritance disputes. Even some of the journalists who had covered our story became allies, using their platforms to educate people about the warning signs of elder financial abuse. Most importantly, our work attracted other survivors, people who had escaped family predators or lost loved ones to inheritance murders. Building community with other survivors helped me understand that my experience with David and Michael wasn't unique, but my survival and eventual triumph could serve as proof that justice was possible even when the system seemed stacked against victims. On the 3rd anniversary of Jameson's death, Sarah, Rodriguez, and I held a memorial service in the mansion's garden. We planted 3 new rose bushes, one for Jameson, one for Linda, and one for Rebecca, creating a living monument to the people whose deaths had taught us to fight for the living. Standing in that garden with my husband Rodriguez and my stepdaughter Sarah, surrounded by flowers that would bloom long after we were gone, I finally understood what Jameson had meant when he called me his partner in justice. He hadn't just been protecting me from his sons, he had been preparing me to protect others who would face similar dangers. My real inheritance wasn't money or property. It was the strength to transform survival into service, trauma into triumph, and grief into a force for protecting the vulnerable. Sometimes the greatest legacy isn't what you leave behind, it's what you inspire others to build from the ashes of what was destroyed. If Margaret's journey inspired you, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories of triumph over betrayal, I thought, remembering the YouTube audience that would hear this story. But more importantly, I hoped they would understand that every ending is also a beginning, and that sometimes the people who try to destroy you end up creating something far more powerful than they ever imagined possible. What would you want your legacy to be? Tell me in the comments what matters most to you, because the story of inheritance isn't just about money, it's about the values we pass down and the strength we discover in ourselves when everything seems lost. Sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't money, it's the strength to fight for what's right, and the wisdom to know that justice delayed isn't justice denied. It's justice preparing for the perfect moment to strike.